Oh, yeah, and welcome back to the Defense and Statecraft Forum. We're going to start panel two on defense and deterrence in Europe. We have all three of our speakers with us, and I'd like to, at this moment, just invite them to switch on their videos and maybe just very briefly just say a quick hi or hello, just to confirm that your microphones are all working. So we can start with Justin, a quick hi.
Hi, I'm Justin Logan.
Thanks, Justin. Great. Kristi?
Hello, Kristi Raik here. Good to be with you.
Thanks so much. And then Rachel.
Rachel, hi. Hello, this
Thanks.
is Kristi.
Fantastic. Just first of all, a warm welcome and thank you to each of our speakers. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of our discussion and an introduction, let me just also, for the benefit of our speakers and also for those online, just to underline that we're not operating under the Chatham House rule today, so you can be quoted. With no further delay, let me jump into some of the substance, which I think probably the question of defense and deterrence in Europe probably needs no introduction at the moment, because it's pretty much on the headlines everywhere, and is at least seemingly, if you're following social media very acutely, it seems to be changing every minute, hour, and day as we speak. But I think some of the fundamental questions about how is the transatlantic relationship changing in terms of defense and deterrence is obviously at the core of our discussion. But also some of the ways in which we think Europeans are reacting to those shifts in the relationship between the US and Europe is also a critical dimension. And let's also not forget that another critical factor here is also the evolution of the war in Ukraine and the discussions about peace and negotiations beyond that. So all of these factors seem to be coming together and posing very real questions, I think, for European leaders. And we've seen also in the last few days and weeks, I would probably say an unprecedented level of hyperactivity from leaders, calling summits, releasing statements, holding speeches, etc., etc. But I guess a lot of us are also wondering, beyond the speeches and the summit declarations and the leader declarations, where will it lead European defense and deterrence in concrete terms as well? And we should expect, I think everyone agrees that, but we should expect over the next 4 years to be prepared for different types of shocks, different types of approaches, different types of language, messages, etc., that we will all have to adjust ourselves to. And as was mentioned in the recent meeting between NATO Secretary General Rutte and President Trump as well, we are looking now towards the summit in The Hague, which is not too far off, to also see what the dynamics will look like within the NATO alliance and some of the questions that we've raised. Again, I'm very lucky in this panel as a moderator to have a very easy task, because I have three absolutely wonderful and excellent speakers with us. And let me briefly introduce them, even though they've said a sound check hi for all of us. First on my list is Rachel Ellehuus, who was up until recently serving in the US government, but is now Director General for RUSI in London, the Royal United Services Institute. Congratulations on that move as well, Rachel. Glad to see that you're still around in Europe and with us as well for these types of conversations. Thanks for joining us. Second on my list is Justin Logan from the Cato Institute, and Justin is the Director at the Cato Institute for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies, and has also been really following quite intently and acutely some of the ways in which Europeans are reacting to some of the messages coming from Washington, not just under the current president, but also a bit more long-term as well. And then last but certainly not least, very happy to welcome Kristi Raik joining us from the International Center for Defense and Security. And of course, Kristi, you're Director of ICDS, and also a very well-known commentator, not just in terms of European security, but more specifically, great expertise on the Baltic region, Nordic region, and elsewhere. So thank you all three of you for joining us also on a Friday just before the weekend, and hopefully over the next few minutes we'll be able to have quite a nice discussion. Just in terms of housekeeping as well, I've already mentioned that we're not operating under the Chatham House rule, and after we've heard from each of our speakers, I would just invite the audience to use the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of the screen, to pose any questions that you might have in the meantime. So as you're listening to our speakers, please feel free to pose your questions, and I'll come back to them in the Q&A session. Right. Let's begin our discussion. And first, I think I want to turn to you, Justin, if I can, and really pose the following question, which is that, as I said, if you're following social media, if you're following the news headline, with the current US administration, there is an evolving approach to the war on Ukraine. That's unquestionable. And also President Trump and his administration has also reinforced, I think, some core messages to allies. Firstly, on defense investment, so spending more on defense, which has been a long-term message posed to Europeans. And then I think as a kind of connection to that point on defense investment is also capabilities. So being ready to be able to defend yourself if the moment arises. Again, we've seen a few summits. We've seen the London summit. Also in Brussels here, we saw the Special European Council on European Defense with leaders coming together. And I guess my main question to you as a US observer and as a US observer looking at Europe specifically, do you think that the Europeans at the moment truly accept or understand actually the fundamental shift underway with President Trump and also the seeming shift in his approach to European security? Do you still get the sense that Europeans are still living in a kind of wonderland, or are they really adjusting to the realities? Justin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. It's an honor to be here on this prestigious panel and participate. I benefited a lot from the first panel as well. I'm in the peculiar position of being a sort of Trump whisperer to the Europeans, as I have been for about a year or so. I've never had so many, I'm here in Washington, D.C., European embassies reaching out to try to figure out what was likely coming. And my story then is my story now, which was that we saw this train coming from a long way off. That the idea anyone should be surprised says something about the extent to which we were engaged in groupthink, because for whatever else one wants to say about the current president of the United States, he's quite blunt and quite clear. So as to whether I sense the Europeans apprehending the extent of the transformation that's happening. It's Friday, so I'm going to try to be as sunny and optimistic as I can here, and I'll give two answers: maybe, but also no. So that's as sunny as I get as an analyst of these questions. I think that the moves that have taken place over the last 6 weeks or so, in particular the Rearm Europe initiative, which was mentioned on the first panel, has to be viewed as a salutary development from the United States point of view. I just think that the relaxation of the strictures of this Growth and Stability Pact, in addition to the financing. Now, what one makes of this is, of course, a very much open question. But I think it does demonstrate some sense of urgency and appreciation of what's happening. And then, of course, there was the news breaking out of Germany today that there is apparently a deal that has been brokered by the new Bundeskanzler to do the infrastructure and defense program that he wanted to do. I'm someone who's almost always been disappointed by grand German pronouncements on defense procurement and things of this nature. So I will very much await the details as with the Rearm Europe initiative. But I just think you have to be a real hardened cynic to wave off those as superfluous or irrelevant. So that's the happy part. I think there have been some developments that have been puzzling. My attitude was always that it would be rational for the Europeans to try to slow walk any real shift of the burden of defense for reasons that are entirely transactional, mercenary, and easy to explain, right? The Europeans should want as much American materiel forward deployment as they're likely to get. So you heard Emmanuel Macron talking about, well, it will take 10 years for the Europeans. You may not have 10 years. There may not be 10 years. So I do think that that is somewhat concerning, as was, I think it was both. I think the discussion about the nuclear deterrent has two different ways to look at it. On the one hand, it does demonstrate some appreciation of the severity of the shifting environment, but also I think to leapfrog the question of conventional deterrence is not the right way to go. I think in some ways the conventional deterrence question is at least as challenging as is the nuclear question. I think by the time you're getting to a question of strategic nuclear deterrence, a lot of bad stuff has already happened, and my goal would be to prevent that from happening. So I can view that in two different ways, the sort of willingness to go and talk about strategic deterrence. A couple things that I wanted to add as sort of complications to this or maybe provocations is I think, but I'm not certain, that the Trump people recognize the interplay between the denouement of the war in Ukraine and the future transatlantic relationship and the share of the burden therein. I think in almost any conceivable scenario, whatever one conceives of as a settlement to the Ukraine crisis, war, I should say, not crisis, is going to be deeply unsettling and unsatisfactory to Ukraine and probably deeply unsettling to many European countries. I think the Trump administration appreciates that, and that will be another source of heightened sensitivity in Europe about their own defense. So you've seen the Trump administration does nothing so well as it does slaughter sacred cows, if you will. So the idea of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, that's in the rearview mirror. The idea of nothing about Ukraine without Europe is also in the rearview mirror. So I just think they don't have they don't play by the rules, right? They don't have the shared framework that many U.S. administrations have. And I will say one thing that I'm working with a colleague on a project on the European defense industrial base, so I was very interested in the first panel. And I thought this was going to be a very heavy lift, right? Trump is a very transactional, mercantilist person. And so I thought that for an American scholar to be making the case that American policy should support a growing European defense industrial base would not be something that the Trump people would like. I thought they would like to have Europeans remain reliant in large part on the American defense industrial base. But one of the things that was, I think, mostly overlooked in the Hegseth address in February in Brussels was that he said that the United States wants a larger, more significant European defense industrial base. And I would just bring that up as, again, trying to be sunny here, it's happy hour where you are on a Friday afternoon. I think that's something good because I think that a larger European defense industrial base is going to be required if you're going to sustain political support for greater defense spending in Europe. I'll just add that, as a sort of, again, this sort of Trump whisperer, whatever my role is here today, I think that we've learned something over the last 20 or 25 years about how sticky both bureaucracies and ideologies can be. Trump is very blunt and sort of boorish at times. But if you look at the speeches that Robert Gates, who is not blunt or a boor, gave in 2010 and in 2011, talking about a dim, if not dismal future, if there wasn't a rebalancing of the lines of effort across the Atlantic Ocean. And then the 2011 speech, he said that there will be a dwindling appetite in the American body politic and in the Congress to defend countries that won't defend themselves. And so this was the sort of genteel, scholarly version of the Trump message. And to my mind, it produced very little change. The Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 got the gears rolling. Trump's provocative rhetoric, which was not really coupled with policy in the first term, again, continued this momentum. But I think I'm sort of uncomfortably wondering whether Trumpiness might have been required to create this psychic break from an accumulated shared conventional wisdom across 3 generations of policymakers that held that the current division of labor was right, or to use Joe Biden's term, sacred, and that something needed to change. So I think that we're in the early stages of something that might move very quickly. So again, my opening bid is the Europeans might be understanding the gravity of things, but they might not.
Okay, thanks, Justin, for kicking us off, and you also made me feel quite old because I was actually in the audience when Gates gave that speech. telling us to get our act together long before Trump was ever on the scene. So thanks for that, and also for touching upon your assessment of where we stand, and also referencing as well the kind of Zeitenwende 2.0. I don't know how many versions we'll have, but also certainly raising the really important question of how do Europeans get from the words and statements actually to action in practice. And I also very much appreciated what you said about the relationship between the conventional and nuclear dimensions to this discussion, which hopefully we'll get to as well. Rachel, if I could turn to you now, and I'm wondering actually, I mean, building on this issue of past messages that were given to Europeans, and maybe not getting into a discussion about how those messages are delivered. We have seen these messages before. We have seen the US insistence on the need for Europeans to increase their defense spending and investment, to develop capabilities. I mean, these are not new kind of asks, but there is a kind of sense of renewed urgency behind them, right? But I wonder, from your perspective, also sitting in London now as well, do you think for Europeans things are as bad as they really seem for European security? And I want to follow that up also with asking you for your impression on, what do you think are some of the key approaches that Europeans actually need to take seriously if they're really going to step up and rearm in practice, right? So again, how do we get from the rhetorical to the reality of doing this? Rachel, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for the kind introduction. If you feel old that you were in the audience with Secretary Gates, I feel even older because I was probably the person who wrote his talking points when I was in the Pentagon as an action officer. So I agree with what Justin said, that we've seen this train coming for a long time. If we look back to the last time that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, we had a national defense strategy in the United States that was talking about a rebalance to Asia as the tanks were rolling across the Ukrainian border. So, the rebalance to Asia has been attempted several times, and I think the US has made some progress towards it. But, the reality of the Russia challenge and Russia threat has gotten in the way. But that isn't the only thing that's been in the back of the minds of European policymakers and strategists. There have also been a lot of domestic imperatives and things that needed to be taken care of at home in terms of infrastructure investment, jobs, et cetera. And so, it's not so much ideological necessarily that the United States has been asking Europeans to step up on security and defense. It's also been out of necessity. I was just assigned to NATO, and this past year was the first time that the United States did not accept all of its capability targets. There were certain areas where even the US said, we can't do that. We cannot meet that level of ambition that you have set in certain capability areas because we have readiness challenges. We've had persistent deployments. We've got sort of a not just a one-peer nuclear challenge, but a two or maybe even three-peer nuclear challenge. So there are a lot of things that are external to who's in power in the US administration or across Europe that have made it such that we've been seeing this rebalance towards the Indo-Pacific and this request for Europeans to do more coming for a long time. Positively, it has been changing inside NATO. We have seen, it's not enough. We're in a new world. 2% is not enough, and certainly that was the message that the U.S. delegation was pushing when I was at NATO. But now we've got 2/3 of the alliance meeting 2%, and a lot of them exceeding it and calling for more. So as we approach The Hague, I fully expect pressure. Not just by the U.S. administration, but by a number of other allies within NATO to keep, raising that level of ambition and investing better. The balance of power within the alliance has also changed. After the renewed invasion of Ukraine, I certainly appreciated that countries like Poland and the Baltic states got a lot more clout. They were polite enough not to say, I told you so, but certainly their credibility went way up. And no longer was it the United States or even the Quad that was calling the shots. Certain coalitions of other allies could really move the needle in NATO, which I would agree is a healthy thing. Equally, on Ukraine has really changed the dynamic. They may not be a member, but they have the second largest army in Europe. And so that makes allies think about integration with Ukraine in a very different way. And smartly, you saw UK Secretary of State for Defense Healy leading the Ukraine Defense Contact Group at the Washington Summit in July. You saw the stand up of a NATO training activity in Kyiv and working alongside US-led contact group efforts in Germany. I think that's a really positive, again, evolution of this sort of transfer of responsibility or more equitable responsibility sharing. You asked, about are things really that different? What I do think is a bit different is the message that Secretary of Defense Hegseth delivered, which was that the U.S. wanted to sort of lead from behind. I don't think he put it that way, but he said, we don't really want to. We don't see the United States taking the leading role in security and defense in Europe. That's a little bit different than I think, even if we go back to sort of Gates and other secretaries of defense who've sort of talked about responsibility sharing, but didn't actively talk about the US role as supporting rather than supported. I could argue that that's actually kind of healthy and that rebalance is a good thing. But it is a nuance that I think we need to appreciate. I mean, I've seen successive US administrations tell the Europeans to step up. And I always make the sort of analogy that it's like when your teenager is ready to drive and you say, here are the keys. And then you kind of go, oh, not like that, not like that. And you sort of try to continue to steer things and sort of tell them how it should be. I only mention that because it's important for the United States to realize, sure, Europeans will step up, they will do more. The US can take that comfortable position of just becoming another member among the 32 at NATO or even leading from behind. But that comes with a loss of influence, that comes with a loss of decision-making power. And I think we may be comfortable with that, but I think we should be clear-eyed about the fact that currently the US does enjoy a privileged position in the alliance and in the world, generally speaking. And when we abdicate that leadership role, that may not necessarily motivate others to follow in the same way. You asked for a little bit of, thinking about on what specifically Europeans need to do, some key approaches. I kind of caught the tail end of the previous session and heard some really smart comments. So I'll just build on those. The investment is needed now. In fact, the investment was needed yesterday. But we also need European agency and leadership on Ukraine. People here in London are really, really impressed with Prime Minister Starmer and how he stepped up. And the fact that he had, not just the usual suspects alongside him, but he had the Norwegians, he had EU leaders, he had NATO leaders, he had Turkey. So it was really like all hands on deck approach. And I think that's the right approach. We really need to move past these old dogmas about third country participation and leaving out countries that are not members of the EU or not members of NATO. Or whatever. I think we've got to move with urgency and at pace. The challenge for Europeans is going to be doing two things at once with very little. So, just as they're being asked to step up on Ukraine and take more leadership there and support Ukraine materially, they also have to look out for their own readiness, because we really do not know with any clarity or with any certainty what Russia's long-term ambitions in terms of territorial acquisition in Europe are. So you can't just throw everything at assisting Ukraine. You really do have to think carefully about retaining some sort of readiness. And I know that was part of the US approach when we were thinking through how much we could give the Ukrainians. I mean, I think there was a lot of criticism of the US for not flowing a lot of ATACMS missiles, but frankly, that's not something we have in spades in our own inventory. So Europe will face similar dilemmas when it comes to readiness and those trade-offs. I already talked about 3%. I think another good thing would be not being sort of attracted by the idea of long-term developmental projects. Europeans need to buy off the shelf the capabilities that are ready today in key areas. I think Germany is a good example of a company or of a country that moved very quickly to buy Patriots and to even go a step further and to partner between their industry and US industry in opening a new production line to get more ground-based air defense systems out the door in a quick fashion. So I would like to see more of that. I think Justin already mentioned the package of measures that the EU put forward, like lifting the debt and debt restrictions, allowing more loan provisions, et cetera, et cetera. I really do think, though, we need to see some quick movement on releasing the 300 billion in frozen Russian assets. That is Ukraine's money. It is due to them for what they have suffered. And I think that, you know, from where I sit, it's you know, you really can't you can't be holier than the Pope, as we say. You know, you really, you know, I understand the current concerns about legality and perception, but I think there are strong legal grounds for getting that money to Ukraine quickly, and it would make a real material difference in helping the Europeans do both. A couple of other points. A big trend that I've been seeing is a tendency when things are shaky at the sort of European Union or NATO level or international level, people tend to hunker down and look to their immediate neighbors for support. So I think regional reinforcement is a way to go. And the Nordic Baltic nations are the prime example of countries who really, when things weren't working for them in the way they wanted at the multinational level, either because it was too slow or too little or not exactly how they wanted it, they just sort of got their act together and created arrangements that worked for them. So again, to take a UK example, the Joint Expeditionary Force became very active in creating response options in the gray zone hybrid space among a coalition of countries that operate and exercise together at a time when that wasn't necessarily something anybody was really thinking about. Everybody was focused on above the threshold. So a little bit more of that regional reinforcement. Maybe the last two things or three things I would say is let's not throw NATO out the door. I understand that a lot of the US language is troubling and shocking and surprising. But, you know, in the press conference yesterday, the relationship between Trump and Rutte and, you know, it seemed relatively copacetic and, you know, even Stoltenberg got a couple plaudits there. But there are some good things in NATO that would be very, very difficult and expensive to rebuild. Extended nuclear deterrence, command and control, interoperability and standardization, the NATO defense planning process. All of those things can become more European without being thrown out the door because we aren't entirely, you know, on the same page all the time. So I would argue for a European pillar that takes the best of EU defense, European defense, and sort of NATO structures. Next, there really does need to be, and I've been asking for this for a long time, a very clear conversation with the US and the Pentagon in particular about what capabilities, what US capabilities will it be very difficult for Europeans, even with a lot of investment, to replicate in the near term? There are just certain things. I mean, the one that the US has always said, hey, Europeans, don't worry about it, we have more than enough, is strategic lift. We always had plenty to go around. Maybe that's not the case. Then we need to have a conversation about developing strategic lift. I don't think that's one that Europeans don't have or can't replicate, but there are others. So we just have to have a conversation of, look, I know United States, there are certain things you need to bring home and reset. There are certain things you need to send to the Indo-Pacific, but what are the no kidding capabilities that need to stay there for the next 5 to 10 years while Europeans continue to scale up their game on security and defense? And then finally, and Justin was kind of getting at this when he talked about defense industrial cooperation and the direction that that's going to go. Will it be transatlantic, European? I mean, again, I think out of necessity, it's going to have to be both for a while, and we have to find a way to look out for each other and work together. I would really welcome it if Secretary of Defense Hegseth was serious about two things that he said recently. One is, again, what Justin alluded to, which is propping up European defense industry. But to do that, we've got to turn to the US State Department and have a serious conversation about relaxing export control regulations. We didn't have a lot of success with that under the last administration, so I really hope we can get some action there. And then the second thing that I think is a really positive development out of the Pentagon is Secretary Hegseth's words about trying to accelerate acquisition, procurement, and fielding of software and more emerging technologies that could offer that precise mass that is much easier to invest in more quickly. We've got too many primes occupying too much of the defense industrial budget. And we really need to find a way to let those other entrants in if we're really going to stay competitive. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rachel. That was extremely comprehensive, and what you said a lot of interesting things. But I think the one thing that was stuck on my mind was this discussion about the 2% to 3%, maybe 5%, whatever percentage you want to put onto it. So I mean, of course, in the next few months, they're going to have to be serious discussions as well within the European absorption capacity to spend more and invest more. And I think you're also very clear and articulate in some of the ways that Europeans should do that. Also quite interesting that you flagged the Europeanization of Europe, or the European pillar within NATO, whichever way we try to describe it. And you also raised, I think, implicitly in what you were saying, a more general question about the US leadership, if we can use that term, US leadership within NATO, US leadership within European security. And I think we'll come back to that in the Q&A session, but I think it was quite interesting to compare notes between what you said and also what Justin said about the potential role there. And then finally, and I'm sure we're going to get back to that in the Q&A as well, discussions about the US defense industrial base itself as well, and some of the conversations and questions that you rightfully raised about capability gaps and whether Europeans can, fill certain capability areas. So thanks so much for that, Rachel. That was excellent. Also, in your opening remarks as well, you did name check the Baltic states, the Nordics, Poland as well, which leads really nicely, I would say, onto Kristi's next question that I have for her. And it's coming back to this issue of I guess, leadership within Europe, or perceived disorder because of certain messages and certain approaches coming from Washington. And I was quite intrigued, Kristi, going back into your portfolio of publications, to come back in the near past to your foreign policy piece, which you published, I think, in January of this year. And you made quite an interesting case there about the role of Baltic states, Nordic states, and also Poland in how they help promote European security interests. Of course, you wrote that probably at a very different context in history. So a lot has happened since that period, since you published it. So I guess my question to you is, since you've published that foreign policy piece and reflected about the role of these states, how do you see that grouping of countries today? And do they, in what ways do they help us kind of discern a future direction for European security? And especially in the context of a potential, American abandonment, for want of a better term. So what role do you see these countries playing in that context? Kristi, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Greetings from Tallinn. So indeed, when Donald Trump won the elections, the mood in the Nordic Baltic states and Poland was less anxious than in most of Europe, I would say. Because we were thinking we have our high level of defense spending, we have been taking our security seriously over a long period of time. We also had a fairly positive experience of the first Trump presidency, when the US presence in the Baltic region actually strengthened. Although we understood that the second Trump presidency is likely to be different, still we thought there is a tradition of good relations with the US to build upon. And there was some cautious hope also that perhaps Donald Trump would bring some positive new dynamics to the war in Ukraine. And this was also the mood in Kiev. It was partly based on the deep frustration with Biden's policy, which had been supportive of Ukraine, but not enough for Ukraine to win. Ukraine was slowly bleeding out. We could see Biden's administration actually being afraid of potential Russia's defeat. And so the expectation was that maybe Trump would be bolder. He wanted to deliver peace. Maybe he would be tougher vis-a-vis Russia. Maybe he would be ready to put more pressure on Russia. So the approach of the Nordic Baltic states and Poland, also Ukraine, was pragmatic engagement. Stress your own strengths, your own defense spending. Try to offer something to appeal to Trump's transactionalism. So, for example, Finland was highlighting its cooperation in the production of icebreakers, which had been started during the first Trump presidency. Ukraine offered cooperation on its mineral resources. And as you pointed out, Daniel, well, the situation today looks somewhat different. The space for pragmatic engagement has quickly narrowed down during the first weeks of Trump 2.0. The first cold shower was Trump's position on Greenland, showing a really colonialist approach towards a country that has been a very good and close ally. Then came the proposed mineral deal to Ukraine. The first version was even more blatantly imperialist. And then came the disastrous Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky. So the mood in the Baltic Sea region has quickly become much more dark, much more concerned. In society, the discussion is very much worried, although the public official rhetoric tries to stay kind of upbeat and saying that, well, the US is still committed, NATO is still there, we are still maintaining the transatlantic relationship. And to be honest, what else can we do than to keep the transatlantic alliance alive, try to keep the US committed to our security, because there is no alternative, at least in the short term. And looking at the dynamics in Europe, yes, we see some new steps, a new level of at least rhetoric coming out from the EU with these new initiatives. And yet it is up to member states to then kind of seize the new initiatives and actually do what is required to strengthen European defense. And so far, the picture is not too encouraging. We have heard Europeans talking about strategic autonomy for so many years, but I would say the only countries that have seriously acted in a manner that takes us closer to being more autonomous are Poland, the Baltic states, the Nordic countries that have actually invested seriously in defense. While in other European countries, there has been a lot of talk, but very little action. And we can't make Europe autonomous just by words. We need real capabilities. So where we are today, as I said, I mean, still working on the transatlantic relationship, but kind of behind the scenes, more and more discussion about what is required to prepare for a reduced American presence in Europe, in our region, and possibly even complete abandonment by the US, which cannot be excluded, although there are no concrete signs at this point pointing in that direction. We have had some positive signals. For example, just a few days ago, State Secretary Rubio announcing that the foreign military financing to the Baltic states is continued. The Baltic Security Initiative also continuing. So that is encouraging. But there are a number of things that now countries in our region are trying to do to be prepared also for worst case scenarios. So there are efforts to further increase defense spending. Well, Poland is close to 5% already. Baltic states 4% have made announcements about moving to 5%. Nordic countries have made major increases. Then also efforts to strengthen our own defense industry across the region. Interesting cooperation also between Ukrainian companies and defense companies in our region. An effort to learn the lessons from Ukraine, looking at how Russia has been waging war against Ukraine, how Ukraine has been defending itself. What is it that it has used? What is needed? It's a very fast developing field, of course. And I would say the defense industrial companies in the region, some of them are quite agile, not as agile as the Ukrainians. So we are keeping a close eye on that. NATO remains the framework for defense planning. Of course, the NATO defense plans is the only thing we have for collective defense. And the work is ongoing to then build up the necessary capabilities required for the implementation of the defense plans. And yet, again, kind of behind the scenes, also some talk about, okay, but what would it require if the worst case scenario comes true? There is a bad deal imposed on Ukraine. Russia will prepare for attacking one of the NATO countries. And what if the US will not be committed to defend us? So what can we do without the US being there? And these are, of course, very, very difficult discussions to be had. And all the defense plans, of course, are based on the assumption that the US will be there. Then regional cooperation, that's a kind of more positive story to tell, as Rachel also mentioned. It's stronger than ever with Finland and Sweden also in NATO now. We have all the Nordic and Baltic states for the first time in history in the same military alliance, and working closely together also with the UK. The JEF initiative was mentioned already, and it has shown its value when it comes to the protection of the undersea infrastructure, responding to the damage to cables and pipelines, which we have seen happening in the Baltic Sea. But there is also then the idea that in potential conflict scenarios, regional cooperation is something that would be there and would provide some framework for then collective defense, even if the US contribution is reduced. Then there is a lot of effort to push other European countries to do more. The Baltic states have been very active on the frozen assets issue for quite some time, and very good to see that now this issue has become more dynamic again. There are new discussions, new movement. So try to work on that and push the discussions on defense spending, defense industry in Europe. So we are kind of trying to show the way by our example. We do the maximum that we can, and then pushing the others to follow. Also then continue supporting Ukraine. This is a very strong position in the Nordic Baltic states and Poland. To be honest, we don't really see a fast end of the war emerging. We don't really see how we could get there in the current situation. And it's really important what European agency is now in supporting Ukraine. And of course, it's double challenge to further increase support to Ukraine and to strengthen our own defense. But the understanding in the frontline states is very strong that as long as the fighting continues in Ukraine, as long as Ukraine resists and continues the fight, we are in a better situation. As soon as there is a bad outcome in Ukraine, which is possible that it will emerge, as it was mentioned previously, the risks for us will immediately grow. And so we really need to be prepared for that, but we really try to keep supporting Ukraine so that that's about our own security. It is existential for us. And a final issue, of course, the dependence on the US is high. It's also in the field of military equipment, our own purchases. And that's again a kind of delicate issue to discuss. What are the ways to reduce this dependence in future? What are the risks related to depending so much on the US equipment? For example, Estonia has been purchasing the HIMARS systems. It has received the first batch recently. But there are discussions about whether to kind of review the approach, the future purchases for various reasons. But the attempt to diversify our purchases is also something that that is being addressed as far as possible. And of course, we need to buy off the shelf. We need to step up our capabilities very fast. And then it's a kind of longer term issue how to strengthen European defense industrial capability, but it does not it is not an answer to our immediate needs. So I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kristi, for covering a lot of ground as well. And actually, even though you gave us a few illustrations of positive developments within the region that you know best, I think you also sketched out for us some doomsday scenarios, which are also animating political decisions in Europe. And we now come to the Q&A session, where I will, of course, invite audience members to pose questions in the Q&A box as and when they come in. I do have a lot of questions myself, so maybe I'll begin with those first, and then we can come back to the panel. And in the meantime, if any more questions arise, then very good. I think my first question to each of you is really about that doomsday scenario, right? Where it seems like a deal has been struck, whatever that looks like, over the heads of Ukraine and the Europeans. How do you think that impacts then how Europeans should think about the defense in that direct context? I mean, all of you have referred to the fact that you expect a kind of continuation of European support for Ukraine directly because many states see that in their interest anyway and have made a political commitment in that regard. But what does the pressure look like if you have, for example, the US not being involved at all in a kind of deal that has been brokered? What kind of added pressure does that then add to Europeans? Do you see Europeans folding on that basis, or do you see them actually living up to what they've already stated politically, which is to support Ukraine? So what does that look like? And we've also seen out of the London summit already some notions of, troops being deployed, et cetera, But I'm also wishing to address this question of capabilities, especially if in the short term there needs to be some kind of military response. So that would be my first very easy question for all of you to address. The second question that I have is also linking back to this question of the relationship between conventional and nuclear deterrence, and especially on the nuclear question. I think we've seen over the last few days and weeks, France in particular try to take a leadership role within Europe about being at least willing to have certain conversations. How do you see those comments or approaches from Paris, and how do you see other Europeans? I mean, we've seen the incoming Chancellor Merz. We've also seen the UK kind of address a kind of positive response to that. But how does the rest of Europe kind of view this role in the nuclear dimension? And then I have two further points for reflection as well. The first one is on the defense industrial base, right? So I think the assumption is that there are certain capability areas that Europe just cannot produce in the short term. So again, I think off the shelf has been mentioned a number of times. But I'm also thinking that that kind of overlooks the fact that in the US, there seems to be a growing discussion or recognition that the US defense industrial base itself is not fit for purpose as it stands today. So how do we square that circle of the US, of course, giving its full attention to its national interests and to its own productive needs versus the needs that Europeans might have in terms of off-the-shelf procurement? And I say that because I guess all of us have witnessed in the last few days, at least in the media, this growing discussion, excuse me, about leveraging defense contracts, right? So would the US use F-35 contracts to leverage certain, excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. I mentioned F-35, so I probably deserve it. So how is there a kind of leveraging effect going on between existing contracts and not? And then I have one final point, which is on the role of US leadership. I think there are still a few Europeans who suspect that even in this context, we should still expect a kind of US leadership from behind, which kind of has this implicit assumption that there will be some degree of sequencing behind some of the messages that are coming out of Washington, right? So force the Europeans to increase their defense spending, and then we move on to the next issue, which is what capabilities they're going to spend this money on. Should we expect that kind of sequencing from Washington, or is sequencing off the table when it comes to what the US administration thinks Europeans should be the direction that Europeans should be heading in? And that also leads to the point about European unity as well, because I think all of you have touched on the fact that the US role in Europe is not just a military one, but it's also a political one in keeping disunity between European members in check. So when Europeans are disunited and cannot agree, the US normally steps up its function. So without that role, how do we expect the dynamic to kind of evolve in that respect, right? So a lot of sets of easy questions, I would say. We also have in the meantime a Q&A box question as well, which I think you can all read, which is also how will Russia react, do you think, if US pulls out of NATO, formally or not? So that's both the assumption of a formal leaving of NATO or remaining in NATO, but not playing a very active role. Excuse me again. Who should I come to first for these really easy questions? Justin, maybe.
My goodness, I'll try not to monopolize the entire rest of the time. There's a lot on the table. I mean, I think there's an interesting interplay between your first question and your fourth question. The first was about bad or suboptimal. I think any deal in Ukraine is going to be bad. There's going to be a lot of people who are unsatisfied. And this sort of European reaction to that. And then the fourth question was the question about the presence of or absence of American leadership in terms of helping Europeans find their way in terms of making the right procurement decisions, et cetera, et cetera. My sense is that the administration views Europe as entitled to make its own decisions and European countries as entitled to. Like, I think that their view is that any deal that the US would make vis-a-vis Ukraine would involve US involvement in the war, right? In terms of providing materiel to Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. And if the Ukrainians wanted to continue to fight on and the Europeans wanted to continue to fund their efforts, so be it. I think they have a very compartmentalized view of what the U.S. is negotiating, and that in the sense that it's entirely the Ukrainians' right and entirely the Europeans' right to carry the thing on if they so choose. So we can say that's crazy or not crazy or what have you, but I think that's the way they view it. And I think also on the sort of American leadership in terms of procurement question, I think to the extent you still have Uncle Sam lumbering around the continent, we're so darn big and so darn powerful that it's very difficult to ignore us, right? And I think that will have tension, particularly with countries that will be grasping as hard as possible, as long as possible, to keep the United States as deeply involved in Europe as possible. And other countries, I can just say France, that are quicker to come to the realization that it's time to move to a different mindset. On the question about reliance on nuclear weapons and this question that I raised, I guess, in my opening remarks, the United States in the 1950s kind of backed into a nukes-heavy strategy in Europe for reasons of exigency. We had to, right? The conventional balance was just so bad that we made what we found out later were empty threats to go nuclear immediately. If you look at what American secretaries of defense said decades later, they said, of course, this was mostly a bluff. So I think that again, it's a puzzle to me why the Europeans have leapfrogged the conventional deterrence question as quickly as they have to go to what is a very sensitive, the highest of high politics question of nuclear weapons, right? And I think this gets to the question of, we ask the question, can Europe defend itself? It depends what you mean by Europe, right? And, I have, diplomats from, let's say, Mediterranean countries on the far west of the European continent that are rending their garments about not spending 2% of GDP on defense. And I kind of have to say to them on their behalf, they find this very impolitic and unnerving. It's not clear how threatened you are, right? The Iberian Peninsula looks pretty safe to me. I think their behavior is revealing that they feel pretty safe. And if you look at the Baltic states or Poland, they look like they feel pretty unsafe. And it's entirely scrutable to me why they would feel pretty unsafe. So I think that this dilemma is going to be, and this is like the cheap debater's trick to go to, European integration or whatever. But I do kind of think that, and I'm not going to do the Kissinger who do we call thing here, but what are we asking when we ask, can Europe defend itself? And if the question is, we need to make the Baltic states feel very comfortable, that's a hugely difficult task with or without the United States, right? We saw Kaja Kallas in 2022 say, understandably, that under the existing NATO defense plans for her country, at the time she was a head of state, her country would be, this is her rhetoric, wiped off the map, right? It's a really tough problem with the United States deeply involved. And it gets somewhat harder without the United States deeply involved. But I think to construe it as relatively easy with the United States or relatively difficult without the United States, it's hugely difficult regardless. The question on defense industrial base, I don't want to go on even longer, and I don't want to cannibalize my project on defense industrial bases. So I think with that, I'll shut up and leave to the other discussants. Thank you.
Thanks so much for your responses, Justin. Very, very clear. Rachel, let me come to you next, if I can.
Sure. So there was a lot of questions, so I'll skip around a bit. With regard to Ukraine and sort of going over the heads of Europeans and Ukrainians in terms of brokering a deal with Russia, I mean, I think this is the most frightening thing that's happened, because, it might seem easy for the US to take this approach, but they physically do not need to live along Russia's borders. And so to sort of negotiate over the heads of the people who have to actually live with the decisions and the proximity to Russia, I can imagine that's, just unacceptable and really frightening. So honestly, if the contours of the deal that are shaping up now with Russian demands that are frankly maximalist, no European or NATO prospect for Ukraine, removal of all foreign forces, loss of, a large part of their territory, I can't even remember what else was on the list, but really, I mean, it's completely absurd that anybody would agree to that, or much less believe that that was all that Putin wanted. That's just, you know, maximalism, and then creating an opportunity for reset to come back for more bites later. That will, if you want to outline something that will drag people into World War III, that is it. And I just want to be very clear about that. It's frightening. So what will happen? Ukraine will fight on. Europeans will do their darndest to keep Ukraine in the fight, and to tie Ukraine very closely to Europe. And we're already seeing that happen. Look, Europeans do have air defense systems. The majority of assistance, or really all the assistance that's flowing in and out of Ukraine, is coming from European countries. We do have this left seat, right seat in terms of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group and the organizational structures that are both in and outside of Ukraine. So, you know, it's a heavy lift, but Europeans can continue to help the Ukrainians fight on and continue to flow as much critical assistance as possible. You know, the satellite problem, which has come up in the press, that'll be difficult, but there are replacements, including some UK solutions. So I think it's absolutely possible to fight on, you know, for months, if not years, which would be a good alternative to accepting the terrible deal that's being outlined right now. Aside from defense, Europeans will continue to integrate Ukraine economically. Others have talked about the industry integration that's already happening. You know, if I were advising the US government, I would say you're going to lose out on the opportunity to partner with some pretty innovative companies who have exactly the type of technology you need to increase lethality on existing platforms. So, you know, that is a missed opportunity by the US. Europeans have pretty heavy economic power to continue to levy sanctions to make them even more precise and targeted. So I think everybody will continue to fight on if it's a bad deal. Maybe I'll pick up on the procurement question, which is a little grim. I mean, the reality is we need each other. Europeans cannot produce at scale what they need in order to help Ukraine and maintain that readiness I talked about at the same time. For every US aircraft, there's European content, and for every European aircraft, there's US content. And those relationships from the development, sustainment, and training phase are just intertwined. You mentioned the F-35. I mean, the whole project was crafted from the ground up with the idea that all the partners were part of the buy and part of the production, and all of their industry was benefiting from that. So I think the FT had a piece last week where they had a diagram of the F-35, and there were, you know, 10 different nations involved, from the tail to the engine to the radar system. So we've got to find a way to make that relationship work. So to get a little bit closer to some sort of, you know, industrial heft and independence for Europeans, while still recognizing that the way to create the scale and the capability is through these joint approaches. How will Russia react? I just kind of want to take the opportunity to remind everybody that, you know, the Russians are not 10 feet tall. They have a weak economy. They have crippling demographics. Most of the talent has fled the country. It's not a global superpower. Its GDP is smaller than Italy's and about 1/15 of the size of that of the US. So really, let's be a little realistic here. They may react badly only because the situation is so dire internally. They've essentially reoriented their economy to a wartime economy. So they've actually got every incentive to fight on, because if they shut down those production lines that they've reoriented, they're going to have unemployed people, and they're going to have a lot of angry soldiers. And those are some societal problems that they probably cannot afford to tolerate, given the cracks that are already there.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I think you also win the prize, by the way, as the first speaker to actually mention World War III. I think you're on a Friday afternoon. I'm not sure you're very happy with that prize, but but I did take note. Great. I'm going to come to Kristi now for your response. And Kristi, before you do respond, I don't know if you saw in the Q&A box, there was a question specifically to you, which was about the interrelationship between the Baltic and Nordic group and the Black Sea allies. So there was a point there about Russian victory in Ukraine, and I think a very valid question about whether or not these two regions, even though they're seen as separate strategic areas, whether there should be much more cooperation between them. But I give you the floor, Kristi.
Thank you. So first, on Ukraine, I want to echo some of the points just made by Rachel. Well, Russian demands are maximalist because we have not given to Russia a reason to drop these maximalist demands so far. So they keep trying. But I can't see Ukraine accepting anything like that, or European states agreeing to anything like that. So even if Russia and the US would try to make a deal based on the Russian maximalist demands and try to impose it on Ukraine, it would not work. And we should not overestimate Russia. I mean, partly the reason why there was this cautious optimism in the frontline states when Trump was elected is that it wouldn't really take that much more pressure and more time to put Russia in a really difficult position. They have been fighting for more than 3 years. And look what they have achieved. It's not that great. And they are in an increasingly difficult position. Yes, Russia has been kind of able to continue the fight perhaps for longer than we initially expected. It has been able to put up the war economy. It has been able to send large numbers of men to the front to be killed. And yet the Russian capability does have limits. So comparing the European resources and the Russian resources, in a way, it's insane to pose this question. I mean, is Europe able to defend itself? It's a matter of political will, but then, of course, it takes time for Europeans to actually get to the level of capability required to confront Russia and to be credible in doing so. So that is the issue now. Do Europeans realize this urgency to step up, but also the potential that, well, we can take care of our security and defense as Europeans collectively if we decide to do so. It's not something impossible to achieve. Just compare the level of defense spending in Europe during the Cold War to what we have today and what we are required to achieve in the next years. And yes, NATO has to become more European. I think that's the way to move ahead. So keep working within the NATO framework, but then Europeans taking over more and more of the tasks, and also in future, hopefully, leadership. Of course, today we are dependent on the US leadership role. A more kind of negative scenario, okay, if things get really difficult for Ukraine in the near term, and there is the question of what Europeans are able to do in the very near future to provide more support to Ukraine, that is difficult, of course. And the frontline states are not really ready to provide much of forces. I mean, we will need them for ourselves if the security environment gets even worse. Now, I'm traveling, so sorry about the noise, but maybe it's also a sign that I should wrap up. Okay, I will stop here because it's too noisy in the background. Sorry about it.
No problem, Kristi, and well done on multitasking. I must say, I'm completely incapable of doing it. But thanks for sharing your views on that as well. And also, I think what you mentioned about the kind of staying power of Europeans in looking at the Ukraine war and Russia's militarization as a long-term issue, because I think it also links back to one of the points that Justin raised, which is about the difference in threat perception within European countries, right? So I think also we should expect in the context, in the growing context, that there are a number of states that are probably already putting their post-Trump glasses on or lenses on. And also considering that if the economic crisis and an economic crisis kind of emerges in Europe over the next few years because of a global deterioration, will there be countries that kind of, for their own national interests, economic interests, kind of peel away from the idea of rearming Europe, right? Which would be in contradiction, I think, to Poland, Baltic states, Nordic states, who are even preparing for life beyond any potential peace deal, or even life beyond Trump, to assume that Russia will be a long-term threat. So there is an open question there, I think, between Europeans as to what type of threat and over what time trajectory Russia should be perceived. In the last few minutes that we have, I cannot end without posing at least two questions that one of my dear colleagues has put in the Q&A, which is on one of them, which I think ties into what everyone has been talking about, which is about America's role in Europe. And the question there is, what is America's floor effectively? So short of abandonment, what kind of role do we think the US will want to be able to still project within Europe, as Octavian puts it, for effective deterrence? And then the second point also comes back to what we've been mentioning or talking about in terms of European leadership, and that's specifically on the role of Poland here, because I think also there are questions within the Trump administration about, as Justin also said, who is the phone that what is the phone number that you need to get Europe to act? Is that France? Is that Germany? Is that London? Is it Poland increasingly? So I think there's a question there about who really is stepping up as the leader and the go-to kind of counterpoint with Washington these days. Maybe, Kristi, I don't know if your situation's improved where you are, but maybe I'll come to you first, then Rachel, and then Justin very quickly.
Yes, well, what role to expect of the US? As I think I mentioned already, Europeans need to take over leadership. And this is where we are, of course, looking to the big European states. Well, Poland is the big one in our region, but then we also need the Germans, the French, the UK to do their part. And it's not yet clear what they are going to deliver. But potentially you could think of the US still providing certain capabilities that Europeans are not able where Europeans are not able to compensate for the US for quite some time to come. We will still rely on the strategic airlift, the intelligence, also in the command structures. We still need the US role to be there, but step by step Europeanize European defense. Well, Poland, of course, is very clear on making every effort now to keep the US engagement as strong as possible. And also coming back to the nuclear issue, which was raised before. It's interesting to see the French initiative there. But to be honest, it doesn't look like a really credible solution for European countries that rely on the US nuclear deterrence. It's impossible to see how France could then step in and provide anything that could really compensate for that. So yes, let's have these discussions, but we need to keep the US engaged with the nuclear deterrent. That is, of course, one component of where we really are going to need the US for a long time to come.
Thanks, Kristi. Rachel.
So what's the floor for the US? Well, I hope the floor, like the absolute minimum, would be that the US continues to remain a member of NATO, just on a more equal footing in terms of leadership, voice, capabilities, etc. continues to provide those key enablers that provide reach and force projection that's needed not just for allies and partners, but for ourselves. Yeah, and then we just see more responsibility sharing across the board. What I worry about is that the floor is even lower. And just generally, I now worry that there's a lack of understanding in the US about the value of NATO to US national security interests. You know, whether that's the fact that a stable Europe allows the US to focus on other regions of the world, that's an understanding that economic stability in Europe is good for US markets and US investments, or an understanding about the links between Russia and China. And if things fall apart with regard to Ukraine, that sends a pretty powerful message to China with regard to Taiwan. We already see the PRC moving in to fill the space on technology, soft power, green energy. But I worry that right now there's this sense that the US is sort of all powerful and doesn't really need its allies, and that allies are a drag rather than you know, an exponential adder of value. So we need to make that case if we don't want the floor to sink even lower. And then your second question, oh, who do you call? Well, I think the answer is you need to have lots of phone numbers in the contact book. You know, President Trump likes to engage bilaterally. Really, even in the last administration, was not a fan of multilateral institutions in terms of engagement. Places great stake on sort of personal relationships. I think we've seen some of those personalities who he sort of gets along with. You know, Mark Rutte, Keir Starmer, hopefully Frederick Merz, actually. So I would probably send in that crew and let them carry other people's water.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, so probably more effective to have a WhatsApp group rather than a single telephone number. Brilliant. Justin, let me come to you.
Yeah, thanks. So I actually wrote an article in Foreign Affairs last year with Josh Shifrinson, a colleague of mine at the University of Maryland, that looks at this question of the floor, right? And so I think it's tough to make the case, right? We heard of it, you know, a stable Europe. Europe doesn't look very stable to me right now. And so, you know, if the rule that you follow brought you to this, what use was the rule? So I think that, you know, there's a real sort of puzzle here. But if you look at history, if you look at the historical US involvement in Europe, the fundamental US interest in Europe is counter-hegemonic, right? This is sort of like high church realism, sorry, everybody. But we want to keep European power divided. We came in World War I because we didn't want Kaiser Bill to dominate Europe. We came in World War II because we didn't want Adolf Hitler to dominate Europe. And we came in the Cold War because we didn't want Joe Stalin to dominate Europe. So you have to ask yourself today, is there a candidate for dominating Europe? I would submit humbly that it's not Vladimir Putin's Russia, thankfully. You know, it was mentioned before, you know, Europe has 10 times Russia's, NATO Europe has 10 times Russia's GDP. It has between 4 and 5 times its population. And it has, even at present, depending on how you count, using purchasing power parity or market exchange rates, 2 or 3 times its military spending. Now, can that be rationalized in ways? Can the redundancies be ironed out? Yes. But if there's no candidate for hegemony in Europe, then US policy should change, right? It's the old out of area or out of business debate. And I just think that from the American point of view, there's not a candidate for dominating Europe. And in the absence of such a candidate, then the US role in Europe should change somewhat dramatically. I mean, we're talking about Russian-Chinese links, right? For better or worse, and we can say it was worth the cost, we've pushed the Russians into the Chinese arms in a very asymmetric relationship where they look more or less like a supplicant to the Chinese. Now, you can say it was worth it. We wanted to preserve Ukraine. That's a perfectly defensible argument. But if what we're trying to do is not create Russia-Chinese links, we're doing a bad job of it. at present. Which states to call? I mean, this is a, again, a sort of historic, puzzling question. I agree with Rachel that you want to have a lot of different phone numbers in the phone book. So I think it's true. I will go along with those who have argued that Poland's star has really risen, both as a state that has meaningful capabilities and a position where it has equities all across the continent. So I'm not going to argue with the idea that Poland has become, much more prominent and important phone number in the U.S. iPhone, or I don't know which phone we're using here. But I don't think there's going to be one number in Brussels or one number in any aspiring European nation state that is able to serve as the sort of locus of American contact. There's going to be a lot, for better or worse, there's going to be a lot of different discussions.
Thanks so much, Justin.